All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Alyssa Carpenter. I am the events coordinator for McNally Robinson in Saskatoon. Tonight's event is coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. Special hello to anyone joining us through the live stream from home. And for those of you here in person, hello as well. Thank you for joining us. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch of Advocating for Palestine in Canada, edited by Emily Regan-Wills, Jeremy Wildeman, Michael Bueckert, and Nadia Abuzara. Thank you to Dr. Michael Bueckert for being here tonight. I'd also like to thank Fernwood Publishing and Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East for working with us to create this event. Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East was established in 2002 by Canadians who wanted to foster justice, peace, prosperity, and security for all peoples in the Middle East. They seek to provide resources and host activities which enable Canadians of all backgrounds to better understand the dynamics of the region and to work towards solutions. Michael Bueckert is Vice President of Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. He has a PhD in sociology with a specialization in political economy from Carleton University in Ottawa. His dissertation explored the Canadian opposition to boycott movements, and this research involved travel to Palestine and South Africa. And now we will hear from Michael, followed by a brief Q&A. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thanks so much, Lindsay, and thanks to McNally Robinson for hosting this. Although I live in Montreal now, I'm originally from Saskatoon, and I've spent more time in this bookstore than probably any other. So it's very cool to be here. Thanks to Fernwood Publishing for publishing this book that I'm going to talk about today, Advocating for Palestine in Canada. And thanks to CJPME Saskatoon for hosting this. This is really great. And already a few words were said about CJPME, so I don't really need to say more about that. I work there, and I'm able to speak here in Saskatoon today because we're doing actually a tour of some Western Canadian cities, talking to people about building a Palestine solidarity movement in Canada. We actually have an event tomorrow night that's open to the public. And I don't have the information in front of me, but talk to me if you want to know more. And
we'll make an announcement after you talk.
There'll be an announcement later, so that would be fantastic. It's a little strange to be here talking about this book because I was only one part of it. I am one of 4 editors of this book with Emily, Jeremy, and Nadia. And it's actually a project that came out of a symposium a few years ago that was hosted in Ottawa, bringing together for the first time scholars and activists across Canada who are working on issues related to Canada and Palestine. And so a number of publications are coming out of that, but this one in particular is bringing together activists and scholars who are engaged in activism to talk specifically about the lessons of advocacy, of activism, the challenges faced by those who are trying to talk about Palestine in Canada. And there are quite a few great chapters in this book by really fantastic authors, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of them. One of the challenges of sort of creating a new book, because this is sort of a first of its kind, is that there's maybe a danger of trying to, or a worry that it won't be representative. And of course, it isn't completely representative of all the different people, groups, perspectives of people who are working on this issue across the country, but hopefully it's a starting point, and maybe there will be more books in the future that can expand on some of these problems. But the chapters in this book all deal in some way with the problems and challenges of Palestine advocacy in Canada. So whether that's sort of active protest and solidarity with Palestinians, or simply criticizing Israeli human rights abuses, and the backlash they face, the disinterest they face, all sorts of things. And maybe I'll run through a few of those, some of my favorite. I'm not going to have favorites, but some of the ones that you might be interested in, because it's not just me in this book. There's so many great contributors. There's a chapter by Nella Matut. She writes about her personal experiences of being a Palestinian in Canada, and the experiences that she's had, which she describes in terms of anti-Palestinian racism. And there's quite a few in here, but even just the basic experience she's had of growing up and concealing her identity because she doesn't want to be seen as as a Palestinian in a culture that is incredibly hostile towards anything that is Palestinian. There's also a chapter by Davide Masrachi, who looks at the problem of pro-Israel bias in the media, both from the personal perspective of someone who has some experience in the journalism industry, but also exploring some of the structural problems that lead to things like the censorship of Palestinian perspectives. And some of these things that he looks at is the role of corporate ownership of the media, the role of lobby groups, which try to convince news editors to play down criticism, that kind of thing. Another chapter is by Rana Nizal on the rise of Israeli Apartheid Week in the early 2000s. It was actually a movement that was founded in Toronto and became a global movement across the world, with campus groups having week-long events, cities around the world. She writes about how the movement, it was so important for them to build alliances and connections with other social movements to make these intersectional connections against race, all forms of racism and colonialism. But she also talks about her own experiences and the experiences of groups at Carleton University and others in Ottawa, coming up against university administrators who have actually tried to shut down Israeli Apartheid Week events from taking place, trying to even ban posters and that kind of thing, and the way that they navigated these challenges. There's also a chapter by Diana Ralph of Independent Jewish Voices, who deconstructs the idea that there is a single Jewish opinion on Israel in Canada. She actually compares two recent surveys of Jewish Canadians, revealing that there's a significant difference of opinion, of course, within the community over Israel's actions against Palestinians, and disagreement over whether Canadian policy should support those actions. There's a chapter by Tom Woodley, my colleague at CJPME, who takes a strategic analysis of the Palestine solidarity movement in Canada based on his 20 years of experience with CJPME, assessing the movement's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And he talks about that at length in the public event tomorrow, if anyone's interested in hearing more about that. And we have a forward by former NDP MP Libby Davies from Vancouver. She writes about her experiences in Parliament trying to talk about Palestinian human rights, and especially how the environment within Parliament shifted under the Harper government to become more closed, less open for open debate, and what she described at the time as a new McCarthyism against anyone who would dare to criticize what Israel was doing. So those are there's other excellent chapters as well, but those are a few to highlight sort of the breadth of the concerns in this book. The themes in this chapter and across these chapters, of course, looking at the avoidance and even censorship of Palestinian perspectives and narratives in Canada, how difficult it has been for these voices to be included in the larger debate over these issues. Another theme is that comes up again and again is the tendency of Israel supporters to conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism as a way to shut down discussion. Another important theme is the importance of solidarity, of connecting Palestinian advocacy with other movements, seeing the connections between Israel's actions against Palestinians and other issues of racism and colonialism. And of course, dealing with other trends like the BDS movement, for example, the call from Palestinian civil society in 2005 to embrace tactics of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against the Israeli government as a way to put pressure on it to respect international law. So all of these things come up. My own chapter is much more narrow, doesn't get into all of that, but it is based on themes that I developed as part of my PhD thesis in sociology, which compared the debates over the boycott of South Africa during the anti-apartheid movement in the 70s and 80s with contemporary debates over the boycott of Israel today. And maybe before I talk about my chapter, maybe I should say a few words about my background and like why I'm writing about this, how I came to these topics in the first place. And there's a lot of different things I could talk about, but I think pivotal to this journey of mine was in 2006. I spent several months in South Africa learning about apartheid, which it was only a decade after apartheid had ended. And at the time, I learned about the connections of apartheid to the history of colonialism, not just history, but ongoing colonialism in Canada. It's often said that Canada's policies against Indigenous people, like reservations, past laws, were a model for the architects of South African apartheid. So around this time that I had this experience, I also became aware of arguments that Israel's policies towards the Palestinians also amounted to a form of apartheid. For example, there was a rise of Israeli Apartheid Week and groups like Students Against Israeli Apartheid on campuses. Also, Jimmy Carter, former US president, came up with a book, Palestine, Peace or Apartheid, a warning that if there was not a resolution to the conflict, the situation would amount to an apartheid situation. So obviously I was very interested in this after spending time in South Africa. And also in the next few years, we witnessed Israel's repeated bombing campaigns of the Gaza Strip, heavily, densely populated civilian areas, leading to hundreds of deaths, including children. And while this is happening, watching the Canadian government's unconditional support for Israel during and its practices. So all of this got me very much interested in apartheid generally, including in Palestine and in Palestine advocacy in general. And particularly for me, once I got sort of invested in it in an academic sense, it was the similarities between the opponents of both movements that I really found fascinating. So eventually this became the core of my dissertation, comparing South Africa and Israel and the boycott campaigns against them, as well as the organized opposition and backlash to those movements. So this work, as mentioned, took me to Palestine and Israel to meet with human rights groups, and to South Africa to dig through the archives of the African National Congress, who had an office in Canada, and that was really interesting. So my chapter then uses this historical reference point of the South African boycott and its critics in particular to evaluate contemporary arguments that are often made against those who want to boycott Israel for the same reasons, for human rights, for freedom, for democracy. And specifically, my chapter focuses on something called the 3 Ds of anti-Semitism. I'm not sure how many people might be familiar with this. It's incredibly popular. It's a framework that supporters of Israel would use to argue that certain criticism of Israel crosses the line into anti-Semitism. Following the method of the 3D test, any given criticism of Israel is evaluated against 3 Ds. So the first one is demonization, as when Israel's actions are blown out of all sensible proportion. Another D is double standards, as when Israel is singled out or criticism is selectively applied. And then there's delegitimization, when they say Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied. So if the criticism of Israel is evaluated against these, is determined to meet any of these criteria, these Ds, then it's deemed anti-Semitic and illegitimate. As mentioned, it's an incredibly popular framework used by pro-Israel groups across the political spectrum. Even Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has explicitly talked about these 3 Ds in a town hall a few years ago about why some criticism of Israel, in his view, is anti-Semitic. And the 3 Ds are frequently weaponized against critics of Israel. For example, earlier this year, Amnesty International, preeminent human rights organization, put together this 280-page report based on years of research, coming to the legal conclusion that Israel's practices against the Palestinians amount to apartheid, which is a crime against humanity under international law. Not that it's the same as South African apartheid, but that it meets the same legal definition. It was a huge deal, but it wasn't completely unprecedented. The previous year, Human Rights Watch came out with a similar report. And actually, there are about a dozen major Israeli human rights groups who say the same thing, among hundreds of Palestinian human rights groups who say the same thing, but under experiencing apartheid. So this report comes out the day before it launches. Pro-Israel groups release a statement accusing Amnesty International of singling Israel out, of holding it to a double standard, of demonizing Israel, and of delegitimizing Israel. These terms, of course, are not very well defined. They're just applied to whatever one doesn't really like, which is part of the problem. But it shows how these terms are used against even mainstream, human rights groups who aren't just focused on the question of Israeli abuses, but abuses around the world and by any state. So this is some of the danger. And what my research shows is that these claims, very similar claims, were frequently made by supporters of South Africa during the anti-apartheid movement. So Friends of South Africa also believed that their country was being demonized, that it was being singled out for criticism, and that South Africa was held to a double standard, while warning that the enemies of apartheid posed an existential threat to the country itself, not just apartheid as a policy. And my chapter goes through quite a few examples of this in some detail, drawing on archival literature, old magazines, and correspondence with the South African embassy, all sorts of things. And maybe I'll just highlight a couple of things. For example, I write about South African ambassador Glenn Babb in the mid-1980s, who was very notorious going across the country, having these debates, defending apartheid bombastically. And he wrote often that there was an obsession with South Africa. He noted the selectivity with which the world singles South Africa out as a special case, for example. Or I talk about McGill professor John Shingler, who also at the same time as being a professor was the member of this elite pro-South Africa lobby group. He wrote that, I think to single out South Africa on the grounds of either the violation of civil liberties or of institutionalized racial discrimination is a kind of inverted racism. That is, too much criticism of South Africa is actually racist against white South Africans. Third, I talked about Toronto Sun co-founder Peter Worthington, who produced a pro-apartheid documentary in the mid-1980s. He has this quote, "There's a war going on not against apartheid, but against South Africa itself." So again, I go into these arguments in quite detail, but these are very eerily familiar claims made compared to those that we hear today from supporters of Israel, and especially using this 3D framework. So ultimately, I argue that the 3D test, as it's called, does not provide credible evidence that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, as it claims to do. Instead, these standards, things like demonization, double standards, these are standard accusations of unfair criticism, identical to the complaints made by supporters of South Africa, and similar claims are likely to be made by any country facing significant criticism. It's a repackaging of claims that South Africa used to defend its own racist practices, now weaponized against critics of racism in Israel, against Palestinians. I'll let you read the chapter to learn more. That's the high level. And I'll also be talking in more detail with pictures and slides and things at tomorrow's event. So if you are interested in diving more into that, please join us for that. But before I maybe end my speech and go into a bit more of a Q&A, I do want to say that although this book is heavily focused on challenges, I think it's important to stress that things are changing and that there are signs for optimism. I do think that especially more people are aware of the problems. And I think we saw that especially last year in May 2021 during the latest, well, not the latest anymore, but the latest major Israeli assault on Gaza, when there were demonstrations across Canada, people coming out, protesting what was happening. And we saw Palestinians on TV, national media being interviewed, and their narratives brought forward in a way that we've never seen before. And politicians are speaking out even more. Members of the Green Party and the NDP in recent years have pushed their party leadership to take stronger stands on this, especially more recently with the NDP, where now, a few years ago, their policy was quite quite weak on these issues, not wanting to talk about it. Now they have a pretty robust policy on things like apartheid, on forcible expulsions of Palestinians from communities in occupied territory, all sorts of things that they're supporting an arms embargo and other measures to actually try to uphold international law, defend human rights. So these are all positive indicators, as well as I think what I mentioned earlier with these reports by mainstream human rights organizations representing a consensus within the human rights sector of people working on the ground on these issues that Israel's policies amount to apartheid. I think this is a significant change in a paradigm shift in how we think about this, not as a conflict between two equal parties, but about a system of oppression, of apartheid, in which one side has more responsibility than the other. I think that's significant and is going in the right direction. So not everything is awful and horrible. Anyway, maybe if we could open up to some questions. Happy to talk about anything related to anything I talked about or the book, things I can mention. Thanks so much.
All right, if anyone's got any questions, please raise your hand. I'll bring the mic to you so we can hear the questions. Anyone?
My question is about double standards. I think dehumanization, delegitimization, they are interconnected. And the double standards, we also at the UN level. See in the recent Human Rights Commission report, which was on which are the countries which are killing children. The two countries whose names were erased by the Human Rights Commission. One was Palestine and other Israel, and the other was Saudi Arabia. So my question is, how do we know that we have lost faith in institutions such as Security Council and the United Nations because of the double standards, right? So if it could not be NGOs like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, I do not know how many of us would be aware of what is happening. So it's a challenging kind of enterprise. And my question is, how do we deal with these double standards?
Yeah, how do we deal with these double standards is, I mean, it's a huge question and I don't know how to answer it adequately, but I mean, I think our approach, speaking in terms of CJPME, our approach at the moment is just calling attention to it, because I think a lot of people have an idea of Canadian foreign policy as being a neutral sort of middle player that's doing the right thing, is standing up for human rights, isn't taking an aside with the oppressor. But in fact, on the international stage, Canada is one of the countries that is really isolated itself from the rest of the world on these issues. In particular, voting against resolutions every year at the United Nations, which mildly criticize Israel or uphold standards of international law in support of Palestinians. The vast majority of them, Canada votes against. Who votes with them against these policies? Israel, the United States, sometimes Hungary, sometimes Australia, usually a couple more island states, like small island states, against maybe like 150, 160 countries who vote for these things. So Canada is deciding to align itself with Israel while the rest of the world is on the other side. And it's not just there, it's at the World Health Assembly, it's all over. And so I think people don't know that Canada's doing this. And so we need, first of all, to let people know what Canada is actually doing so that they challenge the government on this, that they don't expect this. You know, Canada at the World Health Assembly this year, they made this major speech, this fantastic speech about how, Russia was violating the health conditions in Ukraine, and we can't accept this. We have to stand up against this no matter what, and we'll do whatever we can. And then the same day or the next day, they voted against a resolution to uphold human rights in the Palestinian territories because it criticized Israel's actions, which undermine health conditions there. So this kind of double standard is so outrageous that the first step is getting people to know about it, and we'll get back to on what the second step is.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, sure.
Thank you for your introduction, actually. Now, I'm more interested to read the book from side to side. I'm very interested about that. The question is, it seems there a momentum here for support for Palestine. What do you think? What's the best way to use that momentum and to get more people about this?
That's a really good question. My sort of like selfish answer is to join CJPME. But no, there's lots of organizations doing good work, and I think the momentum, I think something that Tom sometimes talks about is that there's periods of momentum where everyone is talking about it, they're in the streets, and then there's periods of quiet. Or it doesn't mean there's quiet on the ground in Palestine, but we're not reading about it in the news, people aren't engaged on those issues. And we need to make sure that in the downtime, when people aren't all over social media talking about it, they're not in the streets, that we continue to do the work and we continue to prepare for moments when people are interested again, so that they have something to do. I'm not sure there's a single thing to point to. There's lots of different things we can do. Like we are trying to engage with members of parliament to adopt policies that would actually put pressure, that would pose consequences for ongoing occupation, for Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem, for the forcible transfer of these communities in the West Bank, which would be a war. Canada's policy right now incentivizes these things. We need to make it a disincentivized situation. We need to put consequences so that business as usual can continue. I think talking to politicians right now, when people aren't really interested, is really important, so that they're more ready to speak out, for example, when it becomes sort of a hot button issue. But anyway, that's just one tiny sliver of things we can do, and hopefully we can chat more about this.
Thank you for your talk. It's interesting that it's the grassroots members of the NDP and the Green Party who are pushing the leadership on that. Do you see any results of that in the House of Parliament? And also, I'd be really interested to know what kind of pushback are you getting from people who are attempting to stonewall? What's the Democratic?
There's definitely been a lot of movement, and it's a result of this grassroots pressure in these political parties. With the Green Party, for example, they adopted a resolution a few years ago, which is quite strong, and it talks about imposing measures to uphold international law. There's a whole bunch of things that they support, forms of economic pressure and that kind of thing, and that's really important. The problem is that the leadership of the party doesn't always listen to that, and there have been some sort of, I don't know, some leaders are more interested in talking about those issues than others, but the fact that it's on the policy books means that there's a lot of room for party members to continue to try to hold their leadership accountable to what is officially party policy. So it's a step in the right direction, at least, and gives them something to work with. With the NDP, like, for example, like there's been significant movement just in like the last 5-6 years. I was at the NDP convention in 2018 when they attempted to adopt a simple resolution in support of Palestinian rights, and the party leadership blocked it from coming to the floor for a debate. So absolutely prevented it through very dirty tricks to stop there from being even a debate on it. A few years later, last year in 2021 at the convention, party members actually brought forward a resolution that was even stronger, and it passed and made it to the floor. It passed with like 80% of the party voting in favor of it. So a significant step. And again, that doesn't mean the leadership's going to do anything. But in the last year, we've seen a real transformation, I think in part because of the foreign affairs critic right now, Heather McPherson, who I think I think kind of believes this a little bit more. That's my sense. And actually the party has been way more outspoken. You know, not just that they have sort of the right positions, but they're actually talking about it in Parliament, questioning the foreign affairs minister, all sorts of things that we didn't see before. And so I do see a result. Of course, there are all of these groups, pro-Israel groups, who are now attacking the NDP very strongly to try to get the party to backtrack. And I think it's really horrible. They're disingenuously saying that these policies make Jews feel unsafe in the party. And so they're saying that these policies, which if you read them, are just straightforward, basic, support for international law, support for what human rights groups on the ground are saying, and these groups are trying to twist it into something that it's not, in a way to try to like coerce the party into dropping it. And I think that would be a horrible thing to do. And so we do, when parties take this, like these small steps to do the right thing, we do need to kind of show our support in the sense that that we welcome this is a step in the right direction, but like you also have to act on it. Policies on paper aren't good enough. They have to actually do something. I can't remember what your initial question was.
What's happening in Parliament?
Yeah, so maybe I did answer it then. But definitely there's movements with the NDP. With the Greens, they haven't been as active because they're in the midst of a leadership race and all of that. But okay, another thing too is that Liberal MPs, there are backbenchers who are starting to be emboldened to speak out a little bit more, but I'm hesitant to push that too strongly because it's only like they're not going very far at all. But definitely you get a sense that the Liberal caucus is not united on these issues, even though their policy is 100% in support of Israel with, it's basically the Harper era policy with a couple of tweaks to it. The caucus is not all on board with that. And so how we push that to try to, to change that, I'm not exactly sure.
Thank you. Just wanted your thoughts on like the concept of exceptionalism seen in all three of these countries. It's like with Israel, see the Zionist exceptionalism with like that's Israel, David versus Goliath myth, all that kind of stuff in South Africa, and anything else that's related. And then just what Canada can do and what Canada has done historically contemporarily as a separate colonial state as well. Itself is kind of an exceptional case as well. Just how those dynamics all play together.
Yeah, that's interesting. The idea of exceptionalism. Yeah, both Israel and South Africa saw themselves as sort of exceptional. Like they would both use language like they're the only democracy on a continent full of sort of backward countries. And sort of that would become an excuse, for example, not to impose democracy, actual democracy, right? Not to give people the vote. So like it seems silly, but people believe this. And there's all sorts of ways that these countries have come up with excuses for why they don't have to abide by international law. They're exempted from the same policies, the same laws as other countries. Canada's role, I'm not sure what to say about that, but with the case of South Africa, Canada wasn't the leader against apartheid. I think that sort of there's a mythology about, but it did impose certain sanctions. It did take steps, even though the UK and the US weren't doing that. So I think that's significant. And even, with the case of Israel, like 30 years ago, during the first Intifada, when Israeli forces were shooting unarmed protesters in the West Bank, Canada actually imposed a military embargo on Israel. It had a policy that it doesn't sell weapons to countries that, where it could be used to violate human rights or sort of used in conflict. And so for a number of years, the arms exports just plummeted, and for a few years was actually zero. And then the only reason that was lifted was because of the peace process, and sort of it was seen as sort of like an incentive to Israel to keep going with the peace process, and also it was an exchange for Canada signing a free trade agreement with Israel. And so all of these things, sort of a period of optimism that went nowhere, has been totally stagnant, but we haven't like said, hey, remember when we resumed arms sales on the assumption that there was going to be progress? There hasn't been progress, right? So what do we do about it? Yeah, so Canada has a history sometimes of sort of doing the right thing, and I don't see any reason why we can't do that.
Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, maybe just going back to the idea of double standards, I feel like the situation with Russia and Ukraine has kind of highlighted that a lot, and yeah, something would be interested to know is what you think about sort of how the Western media especially portrays you know, how the Ukrainians are reacting to occupation and resisting what the Russian army is doing versus how the Western press covers or doesn't show at all Palestinian resistance, and how actually Palestinian resistance is seen as terrorism. So why is one, you know, resistance is like a brave fight against imperialism and colonialism, and then the other is terrorism or is irrational.
Yeah, that's really important. Earlier this year, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there were all sorts of things that we saw that were really eye-opening. Like you say, there were sort of these glowing reports of Ukrainians mass producing Molotov cocktails in their communities, right? And all sorts of things like that, glamorizing resistance, resisting against an occupier, you know, when at the same time, like Defense for Children International Palestine is documenting these cases of Palestinian children killed, shot to death, on, you know, many cases this year in the West Bank, especially. And often the excuse is because, well, they were throwing stones at a tank, or they threw a Molotov cocktail, right? And therefore they were terrorists. And this gets almost no attention. So the exact same strategies of resistance are demonized in one case and celebrated in another. And so it is a clear double standard when one country, and it seems to be because one country we see as like a foe, and one country we see as a friend. I think, you know, also, you know, one of these populations is Arab, is Palestinian, and one is white, it might be Christian. I think that might play into it too. There's all sorts of different things that feed into this, but it's definitely concerning. And we even saw there were a few fact checker articles where like things had gone around, like an image of a bomb blowing up a residential tower went around, saying that this Russia blew up a Ukrainian tower, and they had to have a fact checker saying, no, that's an image from Gaza, from Israel's war on Gaza. There was one of a child standing up to a soldier and saying, isn't this great how the Ukrainian children are standing up? And it was a Het Mimi, a Palestinian girl standing up to an Israeli soldier. You know, these people who are not celebrated in the media are being celebrated in these other cases. So, and then, you know, the implication, of course, is that it's a very different way that that these countries are treated. So, like the Palestinian movement to boycott Israel has been calling for these boycotts, academic boycotts, boycotts of consumer goods, of cultural events, all sorts of things. And the government of Canada condemns this. Meanwhile, it took probably a week for Canada to impose the exact same measures on Russia. And that doesn't mean that, you know, that these things shouldn't, I'm not necessarily criticizing Canada's response to Russia, but rather saying that, you know, Russia and Israel they're not the same case, but they are violating the same principles of international law, whether it's invasion, bombing civilian targets, whether it's occupation and annexation. So Canada shouldn't have this completely different approach to two similar cases of violating international law.
Thank you very much for your talk, Michael. What advice would you give pro-Palestinian human rights activists who would like to work for human rights, but are hesitant because of accusations of anti-Semitism? Everyone who tries to do that is often hit with accusations that they are anti-Semitic, given the history of Jewish suffering in the Holocaust. What happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a serious concern because we see how people who do stick their necks out and say things that are true about what is happening end up facing these accusations of anti-Semitism, and no one wants to face that. It can be devastating, obviously, not only to their careers, but also because people are also opposed to anti-Semitism and they don't want to be accused of something that they're not doing and that they're opposed to. So it is a barrier to people getting involved. But the thing is that there's nothing we can do to stop someone from disingenuously sort of criticizing. It's important to speak out because Palestinian human rights are being violated. But what you can do is take steps maybe to minimize bad faith attacks by being very careful with the language you use, by sort of like holding to principles of international law, citing, respecting human rights groups. There's, just being sure of your facts, like being sure of what you're talking about. That doesn't mean you have to know everything, right? Like the situation isn't that complicated that you have to read every book on the topic to have an opinion. But you do need to do a little bit of work to make sure that sort of you're on solid ground, so that you know that you're right. I think that you can protect yourself a little bit. But it's something that sort of there's created this stigma, which is so systemic about speaking about this. And the only way we get rid of that stigma is by making it more socially acceptable to speak about it. And that only happens when we actually speak about it. So there's no easy answer.
Hi, I back in the early 70s in Vancouver, I was part of a group and we were boycotting South African wine. Remember that? And that one symbol just really caught on. It was something we could do, and it seemed to organize. I didn't know South African wine was that popular even, but it really became a symbol. And then other bigger things happened, and it's been harder to find that one thing to do here. Some of us buy Saskatoon olive oil thanks to Nancy and Fair Trade. I have to replace my printer. Well, I'm not going to buy an HP Hacker because they're deeply involved in data surveillance in the West Bank. So I'll find another printer, but it doesn't really grab a movement. So I'm wondering if there's anything from the apartheid struggles in South Africa, like some things that united a lot of people that we could do.
Well, I mean, even people were boycotting wine that wasn't necessarily across the country, but could have been localized. I'm not sure that there were sort of, like, I feel like people were doing what people are doing now, is that they're looking in their community for a specific complicity of companies, whether that is wine, whether it's beer or sort of produce, and targeting that and protesting that, getting it off their campus. Just politicizing it. And that's the same thing that's happening. I think the key that solidified the movement was that they were listening to the demands of people on the ground through African National Congress and other movements who are calling for these kind of actions. And again, that's the case today, where Palestinians on the ground are calling for these things. And so I think it's true that the products can be harder to find. But there are ones that we can focus on. Things like Sabra hummus is easy to find. We actually had a successful campaign recently where not just in Canada, but globally, we had this campaign against Pillsbury and General Mills, because General Mills had a factory and an illegal Israeli settlement in East Jerusalem producing Pillsbury products. And because of this, it was actually listed on this UN blacklist of companies that are operating in the settlements. And so the Quakers in the US started this campaign, No for the Occupation, calling on General Mills to drop this factory and that they'd be boycotting Pillsbury in the meantime. And then we in Canada created sticky notes that people could take and put on Pillsbury products in their stores, encouraging consumers not to purchase that. I think that was a very great target because everyone knows what Pillsbury is. It's just easy access to everyone, and it's a very clear link of complicity of violating international law. And recently, General Mills did close down that factory. It's no longer operating in Israel. So whether it's a direct result of the work that we and the Quakers were doing, they'll never admit it, but at least it's sort of something that can easily mobilize people, raise awareness about the issues. And so I do think when we can find those that are really easy to communicate, then it's just good to focus on those. They can be really strategic.
Thanks.
Just to build on Vicky's question, your dissertation research looked at South Africa and Israel, and how we as Palestine activists, how should we view progress so far with respect to the boycott of Israel as it compares to the boycott of South Africa, and what's your prognosis and what's your sense of how it's going so far?
Actually, I think it depends on what level you look at it, because I think from a purely economic point of view, boycotts and that sort of thing haven't had sort of like a major financial impact on Israel. But that was never the point of BDS, to actually have a financial impact. The point is political, it's education, it's awareness, it is politicizing business as usual. And so on that front, civil society has adopted BDS, from labor unions to campus groups to churches to all sorts of different institutions have talked about this, continue to campaign on this. So at the civil society level, it has been incredibly effective, but the people in power still don't want to do it, and that's sort of where the loggerhead is. We've talked a little bit about how politics are changing slightly in some parties, but as long as people in power just don't want to do it, then sort of we're at this middle stage. But certainly it took the boycott call for South Africa was in 1959. It wasn't really until the mid 1980s that it really became popular and started to have momentum. So it took 3 decades, where it's only been 16 years since the BDS call for Palestinians. So I think the fact that we don't have these major gains necessarily in the same way maybe that South Africa did, I think shouldn't beat up on ourselves, because we have a lot of work to keep doing.
All right, we've got time for one more question right here.
Thanks for your presentation. I was wondering if within the book, you're originally from Saskatchewan, if there's any reflection about the very different level of awareness across the country. Like Canada's a federal state, we're very uneven. When CJPME invites me to contact my local MP, I know that's useless. What's going on sort of in pockets of the country like Saskatchewan, that it seems we've got a harder political struggle to raise awareness?
Did Tom like to answer that potentially? He's been working on this longer than I have.
One thing is, I don't think it's useless to email your MP, even if you don't think. Sorry, I don't think it's useless to email your MP, even if they're sort of philosophically opposed to what we're trying to say.
But I take your point that obviously there's like maybe levels of awareness and levels of success, and the possibilities, the strategic possibilities of change, I think seem more prominent in some places than others. I don't really know how to address that. I mean, what are even the factors that go into some places being more aware of these things? I think part of it has to do who lives there. Do people generally, for example, are there major sort of Muslim or Arab communities that might sort of be more aware of this than the rest of the population, for example, maybe has more of a political voice? There could be so many different factors that go into it. I think, the fact that politics is federal might help in the sense of political parties. That it'd be very different if I presume your MP is not like NDP or Green. So, if that changed, then they'd be connected to this federal body that has this decision making across the country that does know more about the issues and that would influence them more. I think part of the problem is that it's conservative, presumably. So where they're, it's not that they don't know, it's that they're actively opposed to doing anything about this, in the same way that many conservatives were opposed to doing anything about South Africa, because they didn't want to upset investment, or because they thought that the ANC, that they were terrorists or communists or whatever. It's a similar thing here. So I don't know, that's not a satisfying answer, but
All right, was there anything more you'd like to say?
no, but yeah, thanks again to everyone who came. This is really cool. Thanks for listening to me. And please do buy this book, not just for me, but for all the really cool contributors to this. And if you do have feedback, please let me know. And if there are places online where you can rate it, that would be cool too, because that could help people learn about it or review it. And yeah, if you can just help us sort of spread the word, we really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Just to follow up with that announcement, tomorrow night, we're celebrating the launch of the Saskatoon chapter of Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. So we'd like to invite you. At 7 o'clock, we'll have some conversation again with Michael and Tom. We're going to have Palestinian homemade food, a celebration cake. And that starts at 7 o'clock. It's at the university. I can never get this straight. The Neatby Timlin Theater.
Exactly.
People know where that is. I don't, but I'll find it. It's room 241. It's near the Louis, near the arts building. Okay, so please come, 7 o'clock. Thank you.
All right, thank you again so much to Dr. Michael Bueckert, to Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, and Fernwood Publishing. Huge thanks to everyone who attended tonight, either in person or virtually. Michael said he's willing to stick around and sign some books if you'd like. And of course, we've got copies of Advocating for Palestine in Canada available for purchase. You're welcome to get your copy signed before you purchase it. Just be sure to stop by the main cash desk on your way out. The book is also available online. Thank you all for joining us and have a wonderful evening.
You need to bring some more, actually.